Hi, good afternoon. Oh, that's Ceri. Perfect. We have a full house. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your time with us on this Wednesday afternoon. I'm Sinead Molloy. I'm head of Marcoms at the charity Media Trust. Media Trust is a charity that works in partnership with the media and creative industry to give charities, young people, and underrepresented talent a stronger voice. Over the last 6 months, I've been really lucky to support Media Trust's free strategic comms training programme for climate and environmental charities, Western Communicating Climate. And today I'll be chairing our panel discussion on the topic of intersectionality and the environment. So we have some excellent panelists joining us to explore how we can better address the overlap between environmental and social justice movements in our communications. Starting with Becky. Becky Stormer is Deputy Head of Clients for OmniGov at communications agency MGOMD, who are one of Media Trust's key partners on the Western Communicating Climate programme. Becky also leads the agency's Disability and Neurodiversity Open Group. Fahmida Miah is the Programme Manager for Media Trust's Intersectional Reporting Programme, which works with charities, press and media organisations to help shape the way we tell and collaborate around intersectional stories. Prior to joining Media Trust, Fahmida worked at The Independent, and she continues to write on topics including environmental racism and the impact of the climate and cost of living crises on the British Muslim community. And finally, we're also joined by Ceri Jones. Ceri is a project director at Purpose Disruptors, where she leads their Good Life 2030 project, which is an open inquiry exploring how advertising and media can create desire for the behaviours needed to halve emissions by 2030. Prior to this, Ceri worked at Media Trust, where she also led the Western Communicating Climate programme. So we're happy to have her back in the fold today. Finally, and before I hand you over to our wonderful panelists, here's the agenda for our panel to give you an idea of what to expect. So our panelists are going to spend around half an hour exploring how charities can use an intersectional approach to centre lived experience, to engage new audiences, and ultimately to drive action. And then for the last 5 minutes of our time today, we'll open up the floor for a Q&A. So if you have questions for our panelists, please do enter them using the Q&A function, and we'll try to get them, we'll try and get to as many as possible at the end of the session today. So our goal today is that whatever your role or organisation, you'll come away with something, hopefully a new idea, a fresh perspective, or a strategy to really help you put intersectionality at the heart of your comms. So let's get started with the panel. Firstly, and I'm going to begin with you, Fahmida. What does intersectionality mean to you? And what do you think it has to do with environmentalism and the climate crisis?
Thank you, Sinead, for the lovely intro. Hello, everyone. Really lovely to be here and nice to chat to you about this really important topic. So thinking about intersectionality, I'll just sort of give an idea of how Media Trust have been approaching this. So the definition of intersectionality we've been working with is Kimberly Crenshaw's, a civil rights advocate who coined the term in the late 80s. It's deeply rooted in her experience as both Black and a woman in America. So I have been understanding intersectionality as the ways in which our social identities, such as our race, gender, disabilities, class, and much more, overlap to create unique experiences of disadvantage for marginalized communities. So understanding these overlaps and intersections allows us to identify the root causes of inequality, better reflect lived experience, and impact more effective policymaking and solutions. In terms of its connection to environmentalism, we all know tackling the climate crisis is the biggest challenge of our times, and we can't do that effectively without considering intersectionality and how the burden of climate catastrophe isn't equally bared by us all. Naomi Klein, a Canadian social activist that I really admire, once said that any climate solution that neglects inequality is doomed for failure. And that's because they will not reflect the inequalities faced by marginalized communities, both locally and globally. We know the environmental sector can be one of the least diverse in the UK, putting it at risk of not being able to properly understand the lived experiences of people who are facing the full force of climate catastrophe. So I really believe it's a really important thing to begin to consider in climate communications. Thanks, Sinead.
Thank you so much, Fahmida. And I guess one of the things you mentioned there is this kind of overlapping of identities, and also, as we'll go on to talk about today, the ways that we can work collaboratively together to better tell stories and centre lived experience. So I guess thinking about environmental comms, what do you think, and if we can start with Ceri, what do you think environmental comms can learn from other social justice movements?
This might be a slightly negative way of answering it, but I think we can look at what other social justice movements perhaps haven't done at the speed that we could do this with the environmental movement. So looking at the shortcomings of the feminist movement, and Leah Thomas, who's an environmental activist based in the States, she runs an organization around intersectional environmentalism, speaks a lot about how diverse, marginalized feminists were often excluded from the growing feminist movement. And when they tried to bring attention to the oppressions marginalized communities were facing, they were met with a sort of that will come later reaction, like you're kind of just disrupting the movement. The focus is on feminism, but what that does is just prioritize the needs of white, able, straight women above the needs of other women. So I think looking at how those movements were slow to integrate these terms, and I think there's been a lot of progress in the last few years, aided by Black Lives Matter and the attention that has helped to integrate intersectionality into this movement, but definitely looking at those shortcomings and trying to do better, hopefully.
Thank you, Ceri. That's a great example. Becky, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question?
Yeah, I think the thing is, we all know that social movement comes behind one sort of big sort of title and getting people on that journey. Obviously, we're all on the journey with climate change, and it is the forefront of everyone's thinking. But one of the things that we obviously looked at from when we did the Media Trust Challenge was specifically, obviously, around that sort of disability piece, when we were partnering with Bristol Disability Equality Forum, and it was around that eco-ableism piece. And I think what you just said, Ceri, in regards to having all those conversations, but making sure that they've got space to speak, because I think the point is, if you go with too many messages, people don't know what to do. You sort of enable people people get sort of worried and don't know where to go. So I think it's sort of how do you not hierarchy, that's the wrong word. How do you make sure that all of these problems have a space to come to the forefront, so that everyone can be in the conversation, so that when those policies do come into place, which we were just talking about earlier, everyone's voice is heard. So I think it's a really hard one, but at the same time, I think especially with this new audience, as in the younger demographic, it's at the forefront of everything that they're thinking. It's a total journey rather than just one thing and then moving on to the next thing.
Thank you so much, Becky. And I think you're completely right that actually one of the challenges of thinking about how you can prioritize intersectionality in your comms is how you address kind of the nuance and overlapping identities, whilst also making sure that you're able to kind of simplify and have a coherent, cohesive message. So I hope that's something that we'll be able to explore today. And it would be great to hear from all of you, really, on any brands or organizations who you think are already doing a good job of this, that we could take inspiration from.
Shall I go? Yeah, so I've been thinking about a few different charities. So I think Disability Rights UK are doing a lot more work on their kind of how climate impacts disabled people in the UK especially. So they've been considering the intersections of climate change and the challenges that disabled people face, such as inadequate accessibility to events like COP, that we know particularly that was highlighted last year, or the fact that disabled people aren't always as able to like easily evacuate their homes in extreme weather conditions. And I think they've done a lot of like really great research around those particular kind of unique challenges that disabled people face. So yeah, so that's just one that's been at the forefront of my mind lately.
You go for it, Becky.
Is who goes first? I completely, Fahmida, in regards to that. I think the education within the disability piece is really key. But I think on a grander scale, we can look to the likes of Channel 4 and even and Spotify, where they're really utilising their platforms to get each of these sort of messages out there. And again, I think what I'm seeing from them is they're giving each sort of conversation the space to then bring it all together.
Thank you, Becky. And are there any, I guess it'd be great to know about some of the kind of specific ways they're doing that and what's working really, really well and why?
I think in regards to each one of them has sort of a guild or a sort of well, for better wonderful words, a sort of challenger board, which we've actually brought in our agency as well, to really ensure that it's not just certain people making the decisions, that it's going out to a lot of people so that everyone can feed back exactly how they're feeling about a different scenario, ensuring that they feel represented. And this is really key, especially in these sort of advertising and media space that sort of is my world from a day-to-day understanding, is to really feel like everyone is part of the conversation. And again, going back to that audience and demographic, Channel 4 and Spotify within this space, they're just one of many that are doing really good job, but they are sort of been spearheading it for a while, because Channel 4 has been doing that again and again. They're very challenging in that regard. It is really making sure that they're seeing it from the inside as well as the outside. It's not just a job of being vocal. It's more of making sure that they're living and breathing it and taking all of their lived experiences on board.
Thank you, Becky. I think you're right. And actually, the important thing there is that, I mean, I know some people who are watching might be thinking, well, Channel 4 and Spotify have huge budgets, but actually some of these principles are really easily replicable. So we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of bringing people in and listening to them, but there are lots of models that you can use to make sure that you're listening to the people who are most impacted by climate and environmental issues and who are most left out of the conversation. And Ceri, over to you. Did you have any examples of people you think are just doing this brilliantly already?
Yeah, I've got one charity and then another big broadcast example like Becky's, but I think there is a lot to learn in those broadcast examples with bigger budgets in how you take some of the language that they're using and borrow that for your own smaller but still very impactful campaigns. So one of my favorite series, I May Destroy You, Michaela Cole dedicates an entire episode to exploring how Black and brown people experience climate action movements, and there's a scene where she's asked to be an animal rights activist for a eco-friendly vegan brand, I think it is, in such a tokenistic, awful way. And I think it really beautifully communicates how different experiences of the movement are felt on screen. Another charity example that came out recently in springtime, Attitude magazine, a media partnered with charity On Road Media, launched a campaign called See Our Future. And in the campaign, they worked with Bimini, who's on RuPaul's Drag Race, Dan O'Neill, who is a wildlife presenter, and really took wildlife presenting into a different form and shape. So they use beautiful art direction, fashion. They're wearing Vivienne Westwood and Stella McCartney's clothes. And Dan O'Neill speaking about how he was asked to oppress his sexuality as a wildlife presenter. And it's one of those moments where, like, actually all the wildlife presenters that we tend to see in mainstream culture and on screen are white older straight men. So it's also for charities, any communicator, to ask who are their celebrity patrons, who are their influencers, which spokespeople do they give spaces to, who's behind the mic and who's behind the camera when we're creating campaigns and content. And that's how we could start to shift the dial on representation.
Thank you, Ceri. Those are some brilliant examples. And I think you're absolutely right that actually it's worth stopping to think about, you know, when we're selecting spokespeople and when we're asking people about their experiences of being in the environment, of being in green spaces, of engaging with climate action, who are we asking? Because often we're kind of falling back to the same defaults. And by doing that, we're excluding others. So that leads me really nicely on to the next kind of section of our discussion, which is all about people at the heart of the issue. So I'm going to go back to you, Fahmida, with this question. So one of the things that that is really critical to this is putting people with lived experience at the heart of these stories and allowing them to shape their own narrative. How can we include people from marginalized communities in our conversations about the planet? And I guess as a secondary question for all of you, really, how do we do this whilst avoiding tokenism?
Of course, thank you. Yeah, and as we know, collaboration is a huge part of achieving good intersectionality. Like, we need to kind of pull together our resources and our knowledge to be able to achieve intersectionality. So when working with people with lived experience, I think it's just really important to be aware that people are coming can come with very like vulnerable stories, and it's just really being like a good listener and creating a safe environment for people to feel like they are being valued for what they're bringing to the table, and it isn't just tokenism. And I think there is, I do know a lot of charities feel very wary of like being seen as tokenistic, but I do think there's an element of, if it's something you're doing for the first time, it will inevitably feel a little bit tokenistic, but the point is that the more you do it, the more that won't come across to your audience. So it is just like taking the chance and being really open and ensuring that you're listening to what your collaborators or people who are contributing to you need from you as someone to help them feel safe and feel like their voice is being heard. Another thing is that we don't want to recreate the power imbalances that some can often come from like collaborating with others. We don't want it to be like siloed and top down and speaking on behalf of others. So I think it's important to ensure that you're not recreating that, but you're actually, if someone has something important to say, it's quite important sometimes just to amplify their voice instead of speaking on behalf of them. So yeah, tips from me.
Thank you so much, Mida, and so many great kind of practical ideas in there. And really reassuring, because I think for a lot of people, they are nervous about how to approach stories that maybe they haven't told before. But I guess the really important thing is to start thinking about how you can tell those stories and being sensitive and listening. On the topic of listening, I know that Ceri has been involved in some really great research at Purpose Disruptors. So I'm going to hand over to you to talk a little bit about that and your experience of gathering data on people's engagement with the environment and a good life for them.
Thanks, Sinead. Oh, I wish I was involved. This research launched before I joined, so I can't take full credit for it, but we are actively using it in our work. I think the findings of the research are really interesting. So we, Purpose Disruptors did some qualitative interviews with 3 segments of climate outreaches. Britain Talks Climate Research, I've heard it mentioned several times at today's conference, but it's a really useful guide of segmenting the British population based on how they think and feel about climate change. And within those participants, there were diversities in terms of race, geography, gender identities, and the findings that came out showed that well, we do have different ways that we experience the world, but we all care about our connection to others, self and nature. So when we're thinking about those values, how can we then further interrogate different needs and communities under those core umbrellas? So it's absolutely crucial to do more research into how different communities feel about their connection to others or nature. But I think understanding that we are connected in what we want out of the future and a more meaningful regenerative life post-lockdown and a more sustainable life, it is quite helpful framing. So yeah, really happy to share the link to that research after this. And our website is Good Life 2030 if anyone wanted to follow up and find it there.
Thank you, Ceri. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Becky?
I think I was just going to say, do try. Like, if you're coming from a good, authentic place, no, like, you will obviously potentially get some people putting their hand up, but they will be putting their hand up to help you again move forward with your comms or move forward. Because if people never try, we never get to that sort of next level. So yeah, don't just supporting Fahmida with that in regards to that. Please do try. And we've got, again, multitude, because I know media in itself has sort of been frowned upon in regards to climate change, and we've got sort of a laser lens as well on that. So we have many a tool from a media standpoint as to how to try and make ourselves as carbon neutral or as green as possible, again, both internally and externally.
Fantastic, thank you. And I would love to hear, Becky, I know you mentioned that you worked on our Charity Challenge Day with one of our charities, Bristol Disability Equality Forum, on a specific brief around eco-ableism. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and I guess how you were kind of looking at the intersections of disability and the environment? Yes,
so I don't know if everyone's aware of what eco-ableism is, so I'm just going to inform. So eco-ableism is a discrimination towards people with disabilities that happens in sort of environmental activism. It happens again because the people aren't sort of involved in those initial conversations, so it sort of fails to understand what solutions might make someone with disabilities actually face difficulties, and especially Bristol, for example, where they're really trying to ensure that they're doing the best against climate change. But that's things where they've brought in cycle lanes, where actually it means that people with wheelchairs, for example, now can't access. They're making carbon-free emission zones, so that people with cars that aren't electric cars aren't allowed in. And actually, we know that, again, a lot of people with disabilities don't also have low income as well. And so they're not able to keep up with the latest technology, etc. So it's really, again, that what we wanted to do with Bristol Disability Equality Forum was really bring that to the front. So we came back to the charity and spoke them through who they should be getting in contact with in regards to the MPs in their local areas, etc. And we gave them a big list. We also spoke about getting part of that conversation piece, because it is really getting like after that key message, so that eco-ableism and thinking like me, and sort of getting that sort of hashtag piece, or just getting underneath the umbrella and getting that conversation going. It's that language piece completely for people to be like, oh, I need to know about that element, and really driving that piece forward. And we were really trying to section up their audiences, which is really crucial when you're thinking about these messages. What are you going out to which audience? Because some of them are far more educated than others. So you don't want to, obviously, I've forgotten the phrase now, but is it suck eggs? Teach people to suck eggs, that's the one. But so it's really like dividing up and ensuring who your priority audiences are, and then going out with the right comms. And again, going back to, is it if you're not able to do paid, that's absolutely fine. How can you harness your owned and your earned media spaces. So thinking about PR, thinking about who you are as well, because you and your team are influencers in their own right. You've got a network yourself. So it's really thinking about those elements too, and that's what we've responded with.
Thank you so much, Becky. I think it's really helpful and really important to kind of think about the different audiences and how you might adapt your message for each of those. And I think, you know, in my experience working with charities, and particularly for small charities, a challenge can be that you have one really established audience, but actually the people that you need to reach maybe sit outside of your kind of typical community or audience. So one of the things I would love to hear about from you all today really is how can climate and environmental organizations, or how can the people on this call today work collaboratively with other charities and other organizations to tell more intersectional stories and to tap into those new audiences. And I'm going to start with Ceri.
I think firstly, off the back of Becky's partnership with that charity is collaborate with the media industry 100%. Like they're the ones with these huge platforms, more money to spend, but they don't have that knowledge and access to those communities, all the tools to do it meaningfully. So I think absolutely charities should be paid consultants in that process. Starbucks, I think, this year or last year collaborated with Mermaid, a gender diversity charity, for a campaign about a young trans person who's using their new name for the first time when they go to get a coffee cup. It's really beautiful if you haven't seen it. But that turned into then a long-term charity partnership. They ended up raising hundreds of £1,000s for Mermaid. They changed their internal commitments to LGBT plus people, thinking about their lived experiences in Starbucks. So it wasn't just an ad or a campaign, it ended up being much more of a consulting partnership. So I think charities should absolutely, if they see a brand doing things badly, email them and say, well, we've got assets for you, we have the knowledge of how to do this right. Also, there are loads of toolkits out there. My favorite one is for this particular topic, Good Energy have a playbook on story writing for climate change, a whole section dedicated to intersectionality, loads of story ideas. So if you're in the middle of writing a blog, article, film, that's a place to look. I will post the link now.
Thank you so much, Ceri. Fahmida, do you have any suggestions on this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as Ceri said, working with like the media sector is great, but yeah, also there's always opportunity to work with other charities as charities. I was just thinking about one of the charities we have on the intersectional reporting program, Fawcett Society, which does a lot of work in like, you know, gender equality, recently did a report on the challenges women of colour face in the workplace. And they collaborated a lot with the Runnymede Trust, who have a lot of knowledge and expertise within like, you know, racial disparities and things within the UK, and they were able to kind of plug that knowledge gap of like not just referring to women of color as like an umbrella term, like women of color all face this, but actually what do Bangladeshi women face, what do Pakistani women face, what do Caribbean women face, like having like collaborating with someone else to like fill those knowledge gaps, and other charities that are really well versed in their own area of expertise, which you might not be so much of. And it's always like great to kind of overlap those pieces of research together to create like a really in-depth and considerate like piece of research or like work together.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it gives you an opportunity, as you say, to kind of tap into someone's area of knowledge and expertise, and you don't have to make those assumptions. I guess on a practical level, if anyone here is listening and thinking, oh, I'd really love to do that, but I don't know where to start, what kind of tips would you have for people who want to work more collaboratively with other organisations but don't know where to begin?
Well, you could come to the Media Trust. Well, we have like a huge network of charities that have like joined our programs, that are part of like alumni network. We're always happy to like point you towards other charities that we've worked with in the past. Yeah, I think like going to places that have these sort of like huge networks, there are loads of like, you know, groups that you can join, like LinkedIn groups that you can find online. I think sometimes it does just start with like a Google search of like looking for someone who's like an expert in like an area you're interested in, and just kind of like chasing up. And I think people are always like happy to hear from other people who are like interested in their work too. Like I think sometimes people can be like hesitant. But I know if someone reached out about like intersectionality and environmentalism with me, I'd always be like happy to chat about it. So yeah, just seek out those networks, I think. And there's so many in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, and this is one of them. So I'm sure lots of people who are attending the conference today might have heard from other speakers or met other people, or, you know, talking to people in the chat right now who they're interested in working with. So this is your permission to get in touch with them. We want to see some matches made. And if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A function. We'll have 5 minutes at the end. So anything that you would like to ask, pop it in there and we'll try and get to your questions. So moving on to the kind of final section of this panel, which is all around kind of point of view. So, you know, organizational point of view. One of the challenges for really small organizations, or most charities of any size, is that they're looking to, you know, raise awareness often on a very limited budget and with a really small team. So how can climate and environmental organizations be strategic and choose which issues to speak out on, and how can they have the greatest impact with the messages they choose? Becky, I'm going to start with you.
I'm really sorry. I've half missed that because I was then reading the chat, and I have to apologise to someone from Bristol, because I think they've just written in the chat that it's not all cars. My apologies. It's obviously those with higher emissions. So that's what we were talking about. So just to clarify that. So apologies, I half missed what you just said.
That's okay. Do you know what? I was rambling a little bit. So how do you think the organisations here today can kind of decide which issues to speak out on if they're not sure?
So I think it's all about getting people enthusiastic about and rallied behind what I'd say is one of those key messages to then bring those broader audiences in. Once they're in, that you can then, as we've spoken about, it's the importance of telling all the intersectionality sort of conversations. But I think it's talking to your network, talking and consulting with other people to ensure that you're having those conversations and partnering with other people to then decide actually what's that sort of key hook in regards to a sort of marketing and media understanding to bring people into that conversation. Because I think we're all aware that, especially like it doesn't matter how big your brand or how big your charity, you end up speaking very much to the people that follow. So it's how do you get out with that bigger conversation piece to then bring that audience back into the conversation so that they can add to it and add that sort of flavour of like pieces that you want from all different backgrounds. Hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, you make a really good point that actually when we think about intersectionality and prioritizing it in our comms, it's not just about doing what's fair and right, although of course that is true, but actually, you know, really strategically, when we are being more intersectional in our communications, we're also opening ourselves up to bigger potential audiences. And that is going to be critical if we want to address an issue as, you know, urgent and vital as kind of climate change, or if we want to broaden access to our green spaces and make environmentalism a more inclusive space. So yeah, I completely agree. I would love to hear, do you have any thoughts on this, Fahmida or Ceri, how these organizations can decide which issues to speak out on?
Yeah, I mean, I similar thoughts to Becky. Like, I think it's important to, I guess there's this like pressure to talk about everything within environmentalism, but we're finding out more and more just how connected environmentalism and environmental injustice is to everything in life. So actually you really can't talk about everything, and it really is about looking to, you know, your staff, your area of expertise, and honing your focus a little bit on like what can you truly kind of contribute to, and where do you stand in this like huge worldwide conversation. And I guess, you know, going back to like the collaboration thing, like if you do feel like there is knowledge gaps in what you're saying and you want to speak on something a bit more and you don't have the expertise, you just amplify other voices. And it's important to, you know, part of that is like empowering other people to feel like the solutions can come from themselves and their communities, and that you're not necessarily there to come up with solutions on their behalf. Because, you know, when solutions come from a community, it also reflects their values that you might not necessarily understand or be in touch with. So yes, I think it really is just understanding, doing a bit of like work on understanding your place within this conversation.
Thank you so much, Fahmida. Some really, really great points there. Ceri, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think somebody told me it was 3 C's, and I'm going to try and remember what 3 C's are now. I think it's consult, champion, and commit. So the consult part is everything Fahmida was just talking about, and Becky, consult with organisations doing this well, or other organisations that you might be able to collaborate with. Champion those voices, tell those stories in a meaningful way, make sure that you're including differences in culture and celebrating differences in culture, and then commit and make sure this just isn't lip service. I think charities are great at doing that anyway, but how can you get the big brands like your Starbucks or your Nike to commit, and email them if you think that you could be doing a better job in that consulting part.
Fantastic, thank you. That's a nice 3 C's to remember, which also happily is another 3 C's to add to our Conquering Climate Comms 3C signature, which I think Paige, one of our colleagues, has posted in the video, so do check out those resources. And so a final question from me for you all before we head to the Q&A. How do you think an intersectional approach can inspire people to act on climate and environmental issues?
Can I go first? I think an intersectional approach means that it's talking to them. I think it means so much more to those people and people from all different intersectionalities. And I think that's one of the key issues, isn't it? Is how do we break down those barriers and make sure that those people are paying attention and acting? So if they feel included in the conversation and included within the process, they're far more likely to make those changes.
Yeah, I completely agree with Becky. Yeah, thinking a bit more about intersectionality and just like building your knowledge and how we experience this shared challenge in such different ways, just like encourages a much more like nuanced understanding of how we tackle the climate crisis and how your life in particular may have been impacted by different parts of the climate crisis. So yeah, I just do think like encouraging intersectionality just really encourages people to have a more like deeper and meaningful connection with fighting the climate crisis. And, you know, people's identities completely inform the way they care about the environment. Like certain cultures have like very like spiritual connections with the environment, and those sort of things like play a huge role in the choices we make and how we live out our lives.
I would only add to that, that was really beautiful. I think if you're considering intersectionality in your own comms, then it's going to reflect that you care about it as an organisation, which also feeds into recruitment. So Fahmida touched on this at the beginning, but the environmental movement isn't a very diverse movement, and we do tend to have men at the top still. You have to look at COP to sort of see that visibly in the images of it. So if you're communicating this as an organisation, then you're going to be attracting more people that respect those values, and in turn diversifying your own workforce, which has an impact on comms. So it's all connected.
Thank you so much, Becky, Fahmida and Ceri. Some really great points there to end on. So thank you very much. And I don't think we have any questions in the Q&A. So before we finish, I wanted to mention that we'll be opening applications for Western Communicating Climate in the new year. So if you're a climate or environmental charity and you're looking for free strategic comms training, please sign up for our newsletter, and you'll be alerted when applications are live in the new year. We also share in our newsletter our new resources, including ones on intersectionality and environmental issues, and my colleague Paige has shared a link in the chat. So I think that's all we have time for today, unless there are any questions in the chat. I'm just having a quick look now. Yes, we do have one. So maybe the Q&A isn't working, but the chat seems to be. So a question here from Clara: how can you tell stories which are intersectional when the communities you support are not yet that diverse? So I think that's kind of like, you know, when you're trying to diversify your audience, but potentially you know that it's not that diverse, how can you try and be more representative in your storytelling? And I'm going to give that one to Fahmida.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I still think even if your audience isn't as diverse as you'd like it to be, doing intersectionality is still completely, like, you should completely still be considering that, because I think, as Ceri just said, the more intersectional, inclusive comms we put out, the more you attract a certain audience, and people are attracted to, you know, communications and spaces and media and everything where they see themselves a little bit more and where they feel like they have a space within that. So I think, I don't know, it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing, because you kind of like, I think the more you consider intersectionality, the more you like, you know, consider the ways that other people have done intersectionality well and like take tips from them, it will only just build to a more diverse audience, I think.
I think you make a really good point, and it can be hard to know where to begin, but you know, there is no shame in reaching out to people who you think, you know, you could be a great ambassador for us, and saying, actually, we recognize that our audience or our community isn't that diverse or isn't that inclusive of all the voices who we want to contribute to this conversation, and we're trying to change that. So I think you make a really good point. And so look, I think that's probably all we're going to have time for today. Before I go, I wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists for their really useful contributions, and to our fantastic audience for your time and insightful questions. If you would like to hear more about Media Trust, you can find out about what we do at mediatrust.org. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.